I first met Jos when we were visiting the workers' paradise of East Germany. He came across there from West Germany with Leon and I at a Montpellier meeting, and he was so deeply disturbed by what he saw there that it actually made him ill that day. And perhaps that shows that he has not only a mental and rational commitment to individual freedom, but also an emotional one. Jos says that he started off as a confused social democrat, but developed a strong free market emphasis in his thinking in the course of his years of studying economics. He started off studying economics at UCT and then got an MA from UCLA, where he's currently doing a PhD. He's been a senior lecturer at UCT for quite a long time now, and more recently in the Graduate School of Business. But he's in the process of leaving there, is currently, in addition to doing his PhD, the chief economist for Matheson and Hollage, which is a stockbroking firm. And he also has here as part of his details that he's married and has 3 children, which I think is important.
Right. What is the time limit on my speech? I better kind of be careful of that.
There's 35 minutes set aside for you, of which you can take as much as you want.
35 minutes, so let me just take my watch off, because I have a way of rambling on.
But that includes question time.
That includes question time. Okay, well, I'll try. First of all, perhaps I should have spoken about an economic topic, because that is, after all, my professional area of expertise. But I'm going to talk about a subject that's very close to my heart, especially in view of things that have been happening at UCT, where I've been working and where I'm still nominally on the staff, concerning the O'Brien issue and the question of academic freedom and free speech. And the broader issue there is not really what's going on at the universities, but what is the future of liberal values in South Africa? Is there any future? Is there any possibility of salvaging liberal values in South Africa? Because I think that liberalism is deeply under threat. The soil in this country has never been very fertile for that ideology, and it's growing less fertile. But I hope that my talk won't be only gloom and doom, and that I'll be able to give you some rays of hope so that you don't get your air ticket and passport ready when you leave here. Now, I myself, to put my ideology on my sleeve, I am sort of a free marketeer, a classical liberal. I'm not really a fundamental libertarian in a sort of anarcho-capitalist tradition. And I've put a little spectrum there, just to kind of, well, these things are always oversimplifications, but just to kind of map out the position of ideologies. I want to arrive, like my colleague Charles Simpkins, I want to arrive at a reconstruction and a redefinition of liberalism. Because if it is in trouble, we must know what is in trouble. What exactly is in trouble? And I there draw a spectrum, the liberal spectrum, where I would say that the purest form of liberalism is the libertarian position. The reason I'm not a pure libertarian is I think it's an impractical kind of position. But in philosophical terms, there's no doubt it's the purest, because it says that individual liberty, which includes civil rights and property rights, cannot be violated or should not be violated under any circumstances. The provision of any public good, including defense, unless every single member, every single citizen agrees to the tax he pays, is a violation of property rights. That is a clear, logically clear, extreme but clear libertarian position. I'm a classical liberal who believes that certain goods have to be provided by government. There has to be a state, but that state has to be kind of very carefully circumscribed. And I then go further down and talk about mainstream liberals, who are people who are unquestionably committed to the maintenance of civil rights, but tend to go a little bit fuzzy and easy on the question of the sanctity of property rights. That would nonetheless be a mainstream liberal position. And in fact, I would argue that the difference is is not entirely a qualitative one, but a quantitative one. Since the classical liberal is prepared to violate property rights to provide defense or certain basic regulations or whatever the case is, the mainstream liberal would go a little bit further, but most mainstream liberals, even the ones that are social democrats, would recognize that there's some threshold level of property right sanctity, that if you go beyond a certain level, you end up in tyranny. And that is the idea that there's no fundamentally socialist country, socialism properly defined, not a la Sweden, but a la Soviet Union, that has a democracy that has any kind of vestige of real individual liberty. So most mainstream liberals would understand that there's a threshold point of mucking around with people's private property. If you go beyond that threshold point, you're really into tyranny. And that then is the kind of liberal spectrum. Now, if you go beyond the mainstream liberal side to the left, you're no longer liberal. And of course, the extreme opposite of the libertarian position is the totalitarian position. Now, I found this is quite interesting, but a little bit of an anecdote. Before '83, when I went to UCLA to study, originally on sabbatical leave, my department, the economics department at UCT, was very divided, bitterly divided between what I'd call roughly right-wing liberals and left-wing liberals. And the right-wing liberals like myself, that is classical liberal free market types, Brian Cantor, David Rees, David Solomon, these colleagues of mine, were regarded by the left-wing colleagues, left-wing liberal colleagues, as somewhat beyond the pale. You know, just kind of a bit tainted. The left-wing position was one which wasn't clear on economics, although most were social democrats, and the motto basically was no enemies to the left. I've noticed a big change since I've come back in 1985, a very big change. Suddenly there's a toenadering, because the truth of the matter is liberals of any persuasion, if they are genuine liberals, and I don't mean pseudo-sentimentalists or anything like that, and I'll go into describe what I mean by the pseudo-liberals. Genuine liberals of any persuasion realize they are a threatened species. People like Professor Welsh of political studies, suddenly there's a good rapprochement between him and Brian Cantor in the Senate. People like my colleague Charles Simpkins, I've read his paper on liberalism. I'm not a Rawlsian as he is. I don't agree with everything, but there's a hell of a lot of common ground. And we can't afford in this country the narcissism of small differences between these liberals. If I were living in America or living in England, I'd fight them. They'd vote Democratic Party, I'd vote Republican. They'd vote Alliance, Liberal Alliance in England, or maybe Labour, and I'd vote Tory. Thatcherite meritocracy and all that. But in this country, we can't afford the narcissism of those differences. And that's kind of a new development. That's a new development because suddenly the liberals, whose traditional enemy was always on the right, that is the government, people like David Welsh, who actually went to jail at one stage during the 60s for protesting against apartheid and the subversion of the rule of law, people like Charles Simpkins, who was banned for a long time, suddenly they're finding that enemies are arising on their left-hand side, that the virtues that they held high about freedom of speech and civil rights are in big trouble and are not being respected on the left side either. So they're caught like the ham, as the proverbial ham that was talked about yesterday, between the two sandwich sides, the two pieces of bread. And this is a very serious state of affairs. In some ways, it's now it's heartwarming, but in some ways, it's the heartwarming situation of being in a fortress before the hordes from each side storm it and crush you to pieces. That's if you don't get your passport and your plane ticket ready in time. Now, apart from that, let me just say one other qualification before I plunge into the talk in depth, and that is, I know that liberalism has a kind of a bad image in South Africa. And the truth of the matter is it doesn't have a mass appeal. It's been in the past a function of snotty-nosed, upper English colonial types of people who often were talking about liberalism but sorted that their servant had a separate cup in the kitchen. That kind of story. Now, appeal, yeah, it's very unfortunate that that's the way it went. It's very unfortunate that liberalism has had a hard trouble winning converts among blacks and among Afrikaners, because the two big struggles in this country, I believe, is between Afrikaner nationalism and black nationalism. And nationalists are not easily liberals. Nationalism and liberalism, there are times in history where they've coincided as a kind of a funny hybrid, but they're essentially very different kind of things. And so liberalism has a hard time appealing. But I would say to you, forget about the appeal for a moment, the effects of liberalism or the effects of illiberalism are going to be the same for everyone. In other words, whether Afrikaners, the average Afrikaner, or the average black accepts liberal values or not, he's going to be worse off at the end of the day in this country the less liberal values we have in existence. And that is a fact. And it's also common that when a nationalist group thinks that it's going to lose, that it has no hope, it becomes liberal, because liberal, if you can't monopolize power, well, then let's go for some kind of fair deal. So in the old days, when African nationalism was rather weak, we had many liberals among Africans. And I would say people like Chief Luthuli was a liberal of sorts. And the Liberal Party in Natal had a majority of Africans as its membership. That was a very different situation. Among Afrikaners, there was just no damn hope at the time. Now, all of a sudden, we're finding as liberalism gets a dirty name in the African population, suddenly there are new liberals sprouting up among Afrikaner intellectuals. I mean, as UCT discards its liberalism because it feels too guilty on its left-hand side, suddenly Stellenbosch is rediscovering liberalism. It's a very interesting thing. It's only the loser or the neutral who goes for liberalism. But in the end, to ditch liberalism means being sure that you're going to be the monopolist, that you're going to have power all your own way. And if it's a big group, you've not only got to know that you're going to have power, you've got to that your group's going to have power, you've got to know that there's not going to be warfare and fractions within the group. Because very often, the Trotsky can come up in the Bolsheviks and he gets chopped by the Stalin of the same group. And he thinks that, and Trotsky might have thought, as I said to the commission, this despicable commission at UCT, the Duplessis Commission, looking into the O'Brien affair, I said to them, Trotsky thought that liberal values were bourgeois luxuries. But history proved him wrong, because he needed it in the end. And because he didn't have it, Stalin chopped him with an axe in Mexico, as it happened. Even got him in Mexico. Now, I want to just divide this into 3 parts, although maybe I must just somehow squeeze it because I think that it's, time-wise, it's perhaps too ambitious. I want to talk about a little bit of anecdotes that have happened. I have already talked quite a bit about this. I want to talk then at a theoretical level about reconstructing, redefining liberalism. And lastly, I want to talk about strategies, short of emigration, that is. Now, there's been a decline in liberal fortunes in South Africa, a decline of sorts which is indisputable. Liberalism was always an impotent force, except perhaps in the Cape Colony before 1910, when I suppose if you have to look at a liberal period of government in South Africa, it would have been the colonial government before 1910. After that, with Union signaled the death knell of practical liberalism in South Africa. There have been great individuals. There have been people like Jannie Hofmeyer and Alan Payton and Helen Suzman and Chief Luthuli and all sorts of people, but they've been individuals. I don't know why liberalism declined entirely. Part of it is the changing balance of power in the country. Part of it might have been the decline of the Westminster system in Africa, because most African nationalists in the 50s kind of admired the British system. And when Westminster system started to fall to pieces in Africa, somehow another kind of excuse, a way out had to be found. We got the story in Tanzania about one-party democracy, and this sort of story, that might have been a factor. There was the rise of black power in America. And although guys like Martin Luther King was a liberal, some of the subsequent guys in the hot days of the late 60s poured scorn on liberalism. That might have also had an impact on South Africa unconsciously. Then what happened is the liberals in South Africa were told by young black nationalists in the early days, especially in the university student movements, liberals go to hell, we don't need you, you're a cushion, you're hypocritical, we don't want you, we don't need you, you've always been promising things, you've never delivered the goods, go to hell. This was a very traumatic experience for white student leadership who wanted to do good, who wanted to build a better country. And after all, if you could redefine the country's problems, instead of a nationalist problem, because you can't change your color if it's a nationalist problem, you redefine it as a class problem. And then you go and you out-left black nationalists by going far left. And if it's then redefined, so then there's a role for these white students And that's part of the radicalization process on the campus. Part of it has to do with what happened with Rudi Dutschke and all these anachronistic, romantic, and fizzled-out movements now. We're still, like, you know, the third world, we import the smokestack industries. We also import the smokestack ideologies. And so these guys out there, Rudi Dutschke and the New Left in Europe and in America, the SDS of the late 60s and 70s, we unfortunately got saddled with that kind of stuff a little bit later, because we usually are out of sync. Now we can't afford to go overseas to study, so we're not getting all the new right-wing stuff that's coming out in Oxford and Cambridge and all over the place. So we're not just out of sync, we're now fixated at a certain point. But the point is that in the 70s, among white academics, grew up this whole neo-Marxian and radical critique of capitalism, the school of underdevelopment, and all that kind of stuff. Initially, and then also there's been a fall, and then what happened is that the liberal establishment in the universities felt no enemies on the left. These guys are a bit misguided, but their heart's in the right place. So they were actually encouraging of Marxists coming into positions. And I wouldn't say keep the Marxists out, but I'd watch carefully against monopolization of certain departments, which is indisputable at UCT, and I can mention which departments they are. But what happened in the end is that the neo-Marxists were not as kindly to the left liberals as the left liberals were to them, because they scorned them and hated them behind their back. And now the left liberals are reaping some of the benefits, or some of the costs at least. And then there's the other story about the fall in black support. Well, the Liberal Party is now defunct and banned, in fact. And I was very discouraged to see that the PFP had a meeting, and the PFP is vaguely a liberal party. It's a little bit confused, but it is liberal of a sort. It's about the most liberal party there is in the white political spectrum, probably in the entire political spectrum. And they had a meeting in Lenasia in Johannesburg, and a total of about 20 people turned up. I can't remember which PFP guy was speaking. It's an Indian group area, and of this 20 that turned up, 17 were UDF guys who came to protest the PFP and tell them to go to hell and get lost, and they walked out. That left 3 people in the audience, and they closed down the meeting. So that gives you the extent of overt support for liberalism in the black community, black defined in the broad sense. Now, this is a very serious business. I noticed, as I said, the alienation among left-wing liberals feeling very threatened on their left since I came back from 85 onwards. The whole thing now about the attitude to the rule of law in student protests, it's not quite the same as it was in the 1968 sit-in or the cathedral protest of 72. Now it's not a matter of outmaneuvering the government and showing how they break their own laws and how we are more law-abiding. That was the big moral gesture of the late 60s and early 70s. Now it's a matter of to hell with this law, it's an apartheid state, and we should just go ahead and do our thing. And it's straight confrontation, and liberals never feel very comfortable about breaking laws. I mean, there may be liberals who support civil war. Willy Brandt tried to fight the Nazis from Norway, and so forth. There are some cases where you go against the state, but a liberal has to think twice before he subverts the law, because law is very important, even when it's bad law, in the liberal critique. Now, the attacks, the final development of all this was the O'Brien issue, where O'Brien, a guy who is quite a left-winger in some respects himself, and certainly an independent maverick, very independent-minded, believes in sanctions on South Africa because he says they won't work, economic sanctions, and therefore when we know that they won't work, only a Soviet-American military invasion will solve the problem here. After all, you remember that he was head of the Congo invasion in 1960, and he can't get Katanga out of his mind. You can't accuse him of anything of being non-independent. He's a very independent thinker, even if some of the ideas are a bit far-fetched. And his article on South Africa in the Atlantic Monthly is a must for reading, getting a feel, a sort of almost like a novelist's, journalist's feel for South Africa. But he said cultural and academic boycotts are crazy. They're counterproductive. They don't achieve anything. They don't overthrow the state. They just play into PW's hands. He's happy. They can't keep out the foreign journalists, and we'll keep out the foreign academics. And it's just totally crazy. Well, he told some of the radical and some of the militant black students at UCT this story, and they said, hey, you're being insulting. You know, the ANC said this. The ANC was actually cornered into this silly posture by some other white academics in Europe, as it happened. And once they got cornered into it, that was the line. So he said, I don't care whether the ANC said this or that. It's a silly strategy. So he said, they said, you're insulting us. And they insulted him, and he insulted them in the true style of British debate. So they got very angry, and they ran him off the campus. with a bit of violence, and some lectures were disrupted and so on. And then everyone was up in arms because academic freedom had been violated. Of course, academic freedom had been violated before, when Pitt Kurnoff was chucked off the campus, when Inkatha was chucked off the campus, but a lot of the UCT academics felt that these guys weren't so nice anyway, so they weren't prepared to defend their freedom. O'Brien, however, his credentials were impeccable, and they were prepared, some of them, were prepared to defend his freedom, and so it became a whole rethink. And now UCT is right split between the radicals on the one side, the principal liberals on the other side, and the fence-sitters in between, who are very numerous, by the way. Some of them have been sitting on the fence so long that the iron rods have entered into their soul. Right. Well, all this has not been entirely bad, because it's forced people to rethink what liberalism is. And if you read Ken Owen and you read some of the debates in the Cape Times, there's some sterling stuff there that just couldn't have been imagined a year or two ago. Apart from that, as I mentioned, the rise, rediscovery, or the discovery for the first time of liberalism among certain Afrikaner groups, and among blacks, the situation is not entirely gloomy either, because when Charles Simpkins went into the townships to interview many blacks after the riots for the Institute of Race Relations, what he found, there were some things he found that were very frightening, which was ideas about constitutions which were economically naive, or ideas, bitterness and revenge, which is entirely understandable. But what he did find, which was very heartening, was that many blacks who had lived in the worst places in terms of the violence, particularly the Eastern Cape, who had gone through absolute hell with internecine warfare, suddenly discovered that liberalism is not a bourgeois luxury, is not a white man's invention. It's actually something that we all need, whether we're black or white or pink or anything, because ultimately you never know when you're going to be at the receiving end of some tyrannous force. And so we've got to breed tolerance and respect for each other's views and freedom of speech and all this sort of thing. And maybe that is a ray of hope that one will build on. And I think that there are lots of blacks who are actually liberal, but who are perhaps frightened to come out and be so in a forthright way. I would imagine, I've never met him, but someone like Nthato Matlana would be a liberal. He's a capitalist too, and he's a liberal. He's a nationalist too. It's inevitable that if you're black, you're a nationalist in this country. If people kick you in the face long enough, you become a nationalist. That's why there's Israeli nationalism, and that's why there's Irish nationalism, and all this kind of thing. So, and that's why there's Palestinian nationalism. You get kicked in the face, then you become a nationalist. But I think that in the black community, there is this respect for liberal values if you look deeply enough. And one hopes to build on this, because until liberalism stops being associated with some upper English snotty colonials, it doesn't really have any future. Now, what is liberalism? Let's start with the meaning of liberalism, what it is and what it is not. First of all, let me say what it is not, because this really gets, to you, to a libertarian audience, maybe I don't have to labor the point, but I tell you, when I speak to people like some of the Black Sash members and some of the well-meaning do-gooders and bleeding heart white liberals, liberals at UCT and so on, they don't understand this sort of thing very well. But liberalism is not about sentiments. Now, I think the heart is very important, and I think we've got to relate to each other as human beings, and I think all that sort of thing is wonderful. But it doesn't constitute liberalism. It can lubricate liberalism, but it doesn't define liberalism. Liberalism is not about sentiments. It is not about love of your fellow man, and it is not about compassion for the poor and the underprivileged. That is philanthropy. And liberals may be philanthropists, but being a philanthropist doesn't make you a liberal. It is certainly not about guilt, which comes sometimes with compassion and love, sometimes take it a little bit down the road. If you've got a religious tendency in that direction, turns into guilt. And guilt is not only not liberal, it's very dangerous. A very, very dangerous thing comes out of collective guilt in any country. So it's not about guilt. And let me just quote you the Bible, since many in South Africa take Judeo-Christian ethics as a departure point. If you look at Leviticus chapter 19, verse 17, what it says, and this is a warning to the sentimentalists, to the people I call not liberals, but Manchester Guardian liberals, which is not true liberals, sentimentalists. The Leviticus warns the judge to be totally impartial when he judges between a poor man and a rich man, between a mighty man and a weak man. He should never allow the influence and the bribes of the wealthy and the mighty to influence his judgment in their favor, but nor should he allow his pity for the poor to influence his judgment in their favor. So liberalism is essentially about rights, individual rights, and it doesn't matter whether you're big or small, poor or rich, suffered or haven't suffered. Rights are rights for every individual. Black, white, strong, poor, rich, whatever, doesn't matter. Okay, that's the first point. Now, what is liberalism? Trying to go not for a narrow classical liberal definition of liberalism, but for a broader definition of liberalism. I use my friend Ken Hughes's phrase in 3 words. Liberalism is a critique of tyranny. That's all it is. It is a critique of tyranny. It's not love, compassion, guilt. It's a critique of tyranny. First of all, the liberal starts, and this is perhaps my own view, but I think a very kind of defensible view, and certainly a kind of one that's not far from the mainstream. And perhaps libertarians do have a little bit of, pure libertarians have a little bit of problems with this, but liberalism, as far as I see, sort of a Hobbesian view, is the recognition that force, brute force and power underlies all human relationships. We live in a predatory world, and no matter how much people smile at you, if you don't play the game, they're going to clobber you. And if they can take what they can out of you, they will take what they can out of you. Doesn't mean they won't help you a little bit when you're down and out. That's a bit of mutual insurance. Essentially, we live in a predatory world, and force underlies all human relationships. And so we have potentially the Hobbesian anarchy, the Hobbesian jungle. To stop this, somehow the individual must be protected from his fellow man. So it's a bleak view of society. It's nothing to do with love. A person who operates only out of love doesn't understand this necessarily. But the individual must be protected from the rapaciousness of his fellow man, and sometimes from groups that coalesce. One village comes over the hill and knocks you on the head, and they take all your house, all your cattle, everything, and you've had it. So you've got to be protected against that. So we develop a state with a monopoly of power, a monopoly of force, to protect you from your fellow man. But at this stage, we still haven't guaranteed that the state itself won't abuse that power to become the new tyrant. This is the point I made yesterday. Tyranny is superior to anarchy, but it's still a bloody lousy system, excuse me. So we've got to do something about it. And so we have checks and balances. We have rules. We have bills of rights. We have all the sorts of things to try to stop the state from becoming the new tyrant in the process of trying to protect you against rapacious fellow men. And the rest of it is well known. Now, of course, another thing is that order is a prerequisite for all those other things of law. In fact, when we say law and order, we've got the order wrong. It should be order and law, because you can't have law, you can't have the rule of law without order. And in this country, the government is fairly good, except with a couple of lapses recently, in establishing order, but they're pretty hopeless in establishing law. We have order here, but we don't have law. We don't have the rule of law. We have it to a little extent, but it's very mangled. Now, and that's why a liberal has to be very careful when he criticizes. I'm sorry, I'm going to try and rush it a bit. The liberal has to be very careful when he criticizes things like police operations. That's not to say that the police are above criticism. They should be criticized when they're violent, when they're crude, when they're rapacious, and so on. But I'm not even talking about South Africa. I'm talking about England. I'm talking about America. I'm talking about any of these places. A liberal has to think very carefully before he criticizes the forces of order, because it's very dangerous, because anarchy is one of the biggest enemies of the liberal order. Now, 6 minutes including questions. Gee, sorry. Okay, means. Well, we know about the means. Democracy, there's democracy. We have liberal is usually a Democrat because there's some state taking some state decision. It has to be taken usually on the basis of majority rule. Democracy and liberalism are not the same thing, but they exist in the Western world in some kind of hybrid fusion, sort of confused sort of fusion. Democracy is not enough because of 51% tyranny, so we have Bill of Rights, rights of the individuals, we have separation of powers, and we have all those things. Those are the means. Now, having then sort of talked about liberalism in that sense, what can we say about strategy? And let me just quickly run through the points here. Strategy. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to assume that because you're so convinced that liberalism is such a wonderful system, if it's properly done, that you can go out and crusade being a liberal in South Africa. We know where that gets you. But it's not entirely hopeless. And I like to resort to the ideas of a guy called Moti Tamarkian, an Israeli African historian from Tel Aviv University, who did his sabbatical at UCT. And he said, look, liberals can never be the frontline troops in this country, using a military analogy. The most they can hope to be is the army engineers at the back of various forces building the bridges and kind of manning the bridges and that sort of thing. So if that is the case, I would argue that the best that liberals can do, and it all is not entirely hopeless, is develop a three-pronged strategy. Number one, they should operate on the left-hand side, if you want to call it the Van Zyl-Slubbert option. They should operate behind the lines, among the left, building bridges to the left, the UDF, the ANC, and behind the lines trying to convince people of the values and the virtues and the usefulness of liberal values. Likewise, we should have the army engineers on the right-hand side. We should have the verlichters inside or behind the government lines trying to convince these guys that in the end they're going to lose more by discarding the liberal values. But tactical alliances does not mean selling out your principles, as a lot of the pseudo-liberals do, whose basic motto is man can't do wrong if he's underprivileged, or we can't go against the people, whoever the people are, whoever the leaders of the people are, because it's not always clear who the people, who the genuine leaders of the people are. Now, the third role is for beacon liberals. That is, liberals who not necessarily good at human relations, and who hold up a beacon role of saying, well, this is what liberalism is. We won't bend to the right and we won't bend to the left. That's it. That's the Alan Paton role. That's the Helen Suzman role, etc., etc. The role of the beacon, and that's about the best one could do. I just want to end off with the following statement. I'm not too worried about capitalism in this country. I think that the odds are that capitalism in some way will survive, unless it's the military wing of the ANC that marches in proud and well, because soldiers are generally very bad at preserving capitalism. I think that to run a proper socialist system, you need an immense bureaucracy, a la Soviet Union, even to get the most minimum level of workability. And I don't think we have that sort of story, that kind of bureaucracy in this country available or easily trainable, except the Afrikaner bureaucracy, which is not going to be very happy to administer a bureaucracy under an ANC government. Now, the point is capitalism will survive, but it will survive in a very mangled form. It is a mangled form already. There's no genuine free capitalism for blacks. There is a fairly genuine free capitalism, not completely free, but a fair amount of capitalism for whites. It'll survive in a mangled form, in a bureaucratic form, in a nepotistic form, as it is today, even worse maybe, with pink knobs on it. And some of the redistribution that will take place, as is happening in Zimbabwe, is at the expense of running down capital. So you run down capital, and 10 years later, 20 years later, you pay a terrible price. One African country that's not doing that is Botswana. Botswana runs a reasonable capitalist system. But in many of the other countries like Zimbabwe and Zambia, countries that started off with an immense capital base, have allowed that capital base to run down. And it can be done, but you only pay for it later. This is the danger. Capitalism, however, will survive one way or another in South Africa. What may not survive are liberal values, and that in the broader sense. And that is very, very dangerous. And I think we will all, Afrikaners, English, blacks, others, doesn't matter who they are, they will all be poorer for that. And that is really the danger. Thank you.
Okay, we have a little longer for questions because I've been instructed to take us through to 12:15. Michael.
Yeah, just a few comments if I may, and then a question. I'll try to be as brief as I can. One very interesting is so-called liberals of your ilk, like Ken Owen, are up in arms quite correctly, I would say, of course, about violations of academic freedom. You've identified some of them, Carter, Tikhonov, Cruz O'Brien, and so on, but you failed to mention the consistent undermining and erosion of academic freedom over the years by the state itself, utterly absent from your accounts. The failure, for instance, of the government to grant Martin Lagasse the right to speak at UCT a few years back, deportation of foreign academics, etc., etc., etc. And I think it's interesting that this coincides with it seems much more greater willingness on the part of liberals of your kind, like Ken Owen, to critique the left frequently with great justification, but to fail to respond to the increasing erosion of civil liberties from the side of the state. I mean, what I find disturbing is one of the things you say as well, which coincides with the kind of thing Ken Owen's been saying, which is perfectly set up the ideological ground for the kind of thumping universities are likely to receive now, is that one should watch out for the monopolization of certain university departments by Marxists. So liberals presumably go for the principle of tolerance. I find this extremely disturbing. What are you going to do? Weed out those departments which are heavily dominated by Marxists? If not, why make a statement of that kind? That's just the kind of comments I'd like to make. My question is, with respect to your positions which you sketch on that that there's a threshold of individual property rights after which the system degenerates into tyranny. You need, needless to say, exclude from that particular position probably the most important liberal theorist of the century, at least one of the most important, arguably the most important in the last 100 years, namely John Rawls, who argues that property rights vary according to the application of principles of justice to a particular society. Particular circumstances of one social order might require public property in the means of production. Particular circumstances of another society might require individual property rights. You failed in, as far as understood, to actually mention it, and I think you presented a caricature position.
Should I reply straight away?
No.
There's quite a few points there, I'm afraid. First of all, regarding academic freedom attacked by the right, I've mentioned that liberals have always had, until recently, their enemies on the right. And that, I hoped, would include the fact that academic freedom has been undermined by the right. But I'd like to refer to a metaphor by my friend Ken Hughes, who said in this process, because UCT the radicals are saying, but how can we extend academic freedom here and there when, on the other hand, it's being abused by the state? Do we mean to say that if we find a man with one eye, we should say to him, since you've only got one eye, you shouldn't surely mind if we put the other eye out? We do not balance the disparities in academic freedom by going in and banning the rest and actually getting into a position of academic isolation. I don't think that the idea is to restore the balance. The idea is to fight, to extend those academic freedoms all round. Now, the next thing is, the universities, of course, are digging their own grave in terms of inviting the government in to interfere with them. They have played the game. They have played the strategy very badly. And the radicals in the left, I believe, rather than Ken Owen, are the people whom we can thank for the government now moving into the universities and doing bad things. Because finally, the English-speaking community, which would have opposed the government, would have made a big noise about it, are so, excuse me, pissed off with what's going on at the university that they're probably not going to raise a finger. And that's part of the problem. As for Martin Legassic and Marxists, I believe the Marxists must have their say. Marxism is, unfortunately, it's part of the tradition of ideas, history of ideas, even it's a lousy idea, and I think they should have their say. But the point is that the liberals have controlled the policy making of the university for a long time. We don't control the state. We can't confront the state very easily, but we do control the universities. We can have our little utopias in that little perimeter of the campus. And the point is that while I think that the Marxists should come into the faculties and should teach their thing in terms of the political control of the universities, it should be seen to it that those who get into positions of power uphold academic freedom and so on unequivocally. Now, if they're Marxist, fine. But a lot of the radicals don't. They are using sophistry and all sorts of things to subvert the whole idea of academic freedom. You should just see the UCT academic freedom and the kind of ideas, the kind of nonsense they're coming out with. I mean, Orwell, has nothing on this, by the way. Secondly, firstly, John Rawls may believe that public property rights are okay, and I don't rule out public property rights in certain areas. The question is whether Rawls would be satisfied with a state which is primarily dominated by a centrally planned system and government ownership. So I still would hold that most liberals, average liberals, and average liberal thinkers would go along with the idea that private property rights are quite important. There are perhaps other criteria too, but then they in practice would come out with a kind of a threshold level. Most of the guys I know who are sort of left liberals, who are not free marketeers, nonetheless do respect some modicum of private property rights, are quite worried about nationalization and certain other kind and bureaucracy and things of that sort. So there seems to be a threshold.
Do you have a view on why it is that this shift away from liberalism by South African blacks has been completely uninfluenced by the rediscovery, I think, of a kind of liberalism by blacks elsewhere on the continent? It seems to me extraordinary that even if I may say so, well-informed, educated blacks like Eugene, who are aware of this revolution taking place in Africa, where they're not only restoring private property and deregulating, but they're also restoring basic liberties. They're allowing opposition press to emerge, they're decontrolling the academic sphere. There seems to me the beginning. It might die out, it might accelerate, it might snowball. It certainly a very, very dramatic revolution taking place on the black African continent, and yet South African blacks seem to be almost impervious to it. They seem to be moving the other way. It's similar, it seems, to the way South African whites have always been 10 years behind whatever trend takes place in the world. Maybe South African blacks are 10 years behind whatever trend takes place in Africa. Is that so as you found it, or is there some way of getting them up to date?
Leon, I think that's a terribly important question. I mean, that's absolutely fundamental question and really has to be answered. And by the way, I can just bear out, I mean, when I was at UCLA, one of my colleagues was a chap from Somalia. He was working for the Somalian government. He thought very little of the Somalian government, and unfortunately for Somalia, he may not go back to Somalia. But the point is that what he told me is about how people are sick and tired of a big, rapacious, corrupt, and tyrannous government, and all they want is some kind of free market. He may not have been a kind of, in sort of a pure, carefully thought out libertarian, but he basically felt that the government should get off people's backs and give them a chance to do their own thing. And I was amazed because at first I kind of shied away from him, thinking he was going to give me a straight OAU line, because I'd been through that before, because in 1972 I lived in Aix-en-Provence, and all my friends were Marxists from the Ethiopian variety, and when they got to, they were waiting for Haile Selassie to get overthrown, and when they got back to Somalia, of course, Colonel Mengistu didn't care about the fact that they were Marxists. He axed them anyway. And one of them took refuge in the Cuban embassy, and I don't know what happened to him in the end, and I read it in The Economist because I'd lost touch in terms of correspondence. But I found this kind of something I'd not come across before. There is a big change in Africa today. Now, the question really is why don't we see it among blacks here in South Africa right now? I think there are a lot of closet liberals among blacks, first of all. Secondly, the lag effect may in fact be a story. You know, we in South Africa somehow always lag things. But I think there's a more fundamental reason, and I think it's this. I don't really believe that blacks, and that's why, Eugene, if I take your speech at face value, I'm ready to get my ticket and some foreign passport. I don't take your speech at face value. I don't believe that most blacks who say they are socialists are really doctrinaire socialists in the Marxist-Leninist sense and want to duplicate a Soviet or Cuban type system here. Okay, right. Okay, but you did say you like socialism, and then the question is what we mean by socialism. Then, I think essentially what you expressed between the lines and what most black members of the black intelligentsia express is an extreme rage, frustration at the fact that they've been kicked in the face at the injustice of white rule. That is essentially what's moving the whole story, and you can call that socialist, capitalist, anything you like. Now, the problem is that rage is a reality. It's expressed as an existential expression. It is not unique to blacks in South Africa. It is part of human history all over the world. As I said earlier, when you're kicked in the face, you become a nationalist. The Afrikaners became nationalists because they felt that the British had kicked them in their face. And that wasn't entirely without justification as well. And the problem is, you know, this socialism, first of all, is a very exotic and useful instrument. Because first of all, blacks know that whites are damn dead scared of it. So it's a very nice stick to make the whites feel they got a quiver in return for their sins. And also, there's the problem of the imagery of capitalism being associated with apartheid. At least socialism is something out there, something nothing to do with the whites. It's my enemy's enemy is my friend type of thing. I think that once black rule comes in this country, when it comes, at that stage, blacks will have the power to get over this kind of existential hang-up of which all national movements go through. At that stage, they will want to rediscover things. The problem is how far that's going to be, how much damage we're going to have if we have a civil war between Afrikaner and black nationalism, and whether the various damages won't occur, too much damage occur, to be reversed. But I don't think that blacks can actually sit back calmly, rationally, unemotionally, and look at the cerebral, you know, all the rational advantages of free markets and so on at this stage. And that is the problem. That is the problem. The one hope, however, I don't know, a hell of a thin reed of hope, is that if Afrikaner nationalism and black nationalism realize that there's going to be no outright victory on either side, that all we're going to have is a desert which will go on, a civil war which could go on for 10, 20, 30 years. And let me tell you, if you look at Algeria, I shudder to think, but the Holocaust hasn't even begun in this country. It is frightening how terrifying this country can become in a militarized civil war situation. And one or two generals have said things like 3 million or something between the lines, and they're studying the terrorist tactics of the French military establishment of General Jacques Moussa in Algeria, who killed a million Algerians during that phase. And if it wasn't for de Gaulle, I don't know where it would have ended. Now, if black nationalism and white nationalism realize that there's no outright victory on either side, then either like the Northern Irish will just keep clobbering each other, and everything will just go into a deep hole, or they'll sit down and say, hey, well, in that case, let's try and compromise. Let's try and find some system. But the problem with that is that the government and the establishment does not even begin to know how to address the existential problems of that black people feel, the indignity, the humiliation, and all those things, which is just part of the psychological reality. I mean, that's...
I think it's time to move on to our next session. Mr. Herzog's chairing.